Welcome to European Journeys. This is the fourth stage of a series which explores the city of Geneva, and in particular, we want to see how God shaped Geneva before the Reformation. In our previous stage, we were in a street called Rue François Bonnivard, and today we are just going to visit a place which is 500 meters away from that street. It is in the suburb called Cité, and Cité is in fact the suburb which includes the old town of Geneva, and it is on the left shores of the Rhône. And it is in fact right along the Rhône that we will be today, in a narrow pedestrian road called Quai Bezanson Hugues. It starts near the bridge Pont des Bergues and is only half a kilometer or even less than that, so it's very small. There are several terraces of bars and restaurants there which face the river for the enjoyment of tourists and passers-by. And here too, just like in our previous stages, it is the name of the quay, Bezanson Hugues, which will be our focus. Bezanson Hugues was in fact a Genevan man who lived at the turn of the 15th and 16th centuries. And together with François Bonnivard, Hugues was part of the last major figures of medieval Geneva. And without knowing it, and maybe without wanting it too, he was a powerful tool of God's providence. Well, if you remember, in our second stage we talked about the franchises of Adhémar Fabry, which are named after a 14th century bishop and which became a sort of constitution for the Genevan citizens. This document, which was clearly inspired by biblical principles, emboldened the citizens to take responsibility for their city and became a bulwark against tyranny. It had made Geneva a free city governed by its own magistrates, while the bishop and the emperor were supposed to have nominal sovereignty over the city. Well, Hugues' lifetime is one example of how the Constitution emboldened the citizens in front of external threats. So let's explore a little bit his life. Bezanson Hugues was born in the 1480s as the first of 4 children of a rich and ancient Genevan family. Some of his ancestors, including his own father Conrad, had been members of the Grand Conseil, or Conseil des 50, that is Council of the 50, which was the body of magistrates meant to govern over the city's temporal affairs. Besanson's great-grandfather Pierre Hugues de Copenhague had received the status of bourgeois in 1429, and his son, the son of Besançon that is, Conrad, became a canon of the cathedral chapter until its dissolution at the time of the Reformation, after which he left the city. Well, we cannot understand how important Bezanson Hugues was without looking at the political circumstances of the time. And as we saw in the previous stage, for several centuries Geneva was facing the threat of being swallowed by the powerful neighbor, the Duchy of Savoy. Throughout the years, the influence of the House of Savoy in the city constantly grew, and in Besanson's lifetime, the 2 most influential offices of the city, the bishopric and the vidomna, which was the judiciary power, were constantly occupied by pro-Savoy men. Moreover, the territory controlled by Savoy was now totally surrounding Geneva, leaving it in a state equivalent to that of a siege. As we saw in our last stage, in the beginning of the 16th century, the population was mainly divided in 2 groups, the pro-Savoy, who were called Mamlus, and the pro-independents, who sought to restore the constitution. Because indeed, in the 16th century, the rulers of the city frequently ignored it, in particular when Charles III became Duke of Savoy. Being more impatient than his predecessors to fully subdue Geneva, Charles III had pushed the city's rulers to force its citizens to fight with him the neighboring land of Valais. Well, this was obviously meant to weaken the city's defense. But such a decision was contrary to the constitution, which forbade forcing the Genevans to participate in a third party's war. Well, as we can imagine, the opposition to the Duke grew stronger, and this led to the arrest of several prominent citizens. And then, when a Genevan delegation sent to the capital of Savoy, Chambéry, to negotiate with the Duke did not return home, several individuals understood that it was now time to act. And so, a group of people, among whom was Bezanson Hugues, went to Fribourg in order to acquire the title of bourgeois. Their goal was clear. With more and more Genevans joining the bourgeoisie of Fribourg, the Swiss canton would be compelled to defend Geneva. And so finally, in 1519, Bezanson Hugues obtained the signing of a treaty called Combourgeoisie, of which we will talk about in a later stage, and that treaty was signed between Fribourg and Geneva's Council of 50. And such treaty was understood to be a treaty of alliance between the two sides. Well, Charles III would not have it this way, of course, and in 1522, through his influence, the treaty was broken and Bezanson Hugues lost his status of bourgeois. Nevertheless, Charles could still not reach his objective of subduing Geneva to his duchy, and finally, 3 years later, after having exhausted all his options, the Duke resorted to the military invasion of the city. Bezanson Hugues then fled to Fribourg and continued his operations there. And finally, in 1526, Hugues and his party succeeded to subvert the Savoy invasion. So here we see how Hugues' party, grounded on the constitution, succeeded in restoring the independence of Geneva. But there is another very interesting fact about Hugues that deserves our attention here. Earlier on in this stage, I had mentioned that the pro-Savoy party was called Mamlu, but I left the pro-independence party unnamed on purpose. And the name of the party will surely ring a bell to many, because they were called Huguenots. So, why such a name? Well, this name was given to the members of the pro-independence party when they signed the Treaty of Combourgeoisie with Fribourg. And this was in fact a French transliteration of the German word Eidgenossen, meaning confederate, because of their alliance with Fribourg, which was a canton part of the Swiss Confederation, in which the German language was dominant. Well, I suppose that many of you will have already guessed how this word evolved, because the word Huguenot really evolved into Huguenot, a name given to the French people who adopted Calvin's Reformation a few decades later. Well, this leads us to realize that the Huguenot movement was far from being homogeneous, and this came quickly to light as these events were contemporary of the beginning of the Reformation in Germany, that is, with Martin Luther. Several Huguenots had already adopted the Lutheran doctrines, and this quickly led to separate political visions. Both Roman Catholics and Protestants in the party agreed for the independence of Geneva from the rule of the Duke of Savoy. That was clear. But the Protestants soon envisioned an independence also from the Roman Catholic hierarchy, that is, from the bishop and even from the Pope. And that is because the Protestants understood indeed that the Word of God, rather than the bishop or the Pope or any church council, had authority over all structures of power. And so they began to envision a form of government that would be not top-down, but bottom-up. And this is where the rupture with Bezanson Hugues happened. Because Bezanson Hugues did not endorse the Reformation, and this for obvious reasons. He was known and appreciated both by the Bishop of Geneva, Pierre de la Baume, but also by the Pope. And when the Protestant movement in Geneva grew so strong as to be able to remove the bishop from his seat, Hugues sought to re-establish him. Well, he did not live long enough to see the Reformation officially adopted here, as he died only 3 years earlier in 1532. But the irony is that, without him, the Reformation might have not taken place in Geneva. Moreover, to him even is owed the word Huguenot, which later characterized the French Protestants. And so for these reasons, Bezanson Hugues was indeed, probably without wanting it, a powerful tool in the hands of God's providence. I'm Cedric Placentino. See you next week for another stage of European journeys.